The stranger in the window. I had always considered myself a rational person, but it's amazing how quickly rationality flies out the window when you're faced with something truly terrifying. It all began on a Tuesday night, the kind of night when the air feels heavy with an impending storm and the world seems unusually quiet. I was working late, hunched over my desk in my small apartment, the only sound the gentle hum of my computer. That's when I first saw him. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a dark figure standing outside my window. My apartment was on the ground floor, facing a quiet, dimly lit street. The figure was just standing there, still as a statue, staring in at me. I turned my head sharply to get a better look, but he was gone. I shook it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination brought on by too many late nights and too much coffee. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always the same, a dark, motionless figure staring at me from outside the window, disappearing the moment I looked directly at him. By the fourth night, I was starting to lose sleep over it. The fear was creeping in, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end whenever I sat at my desk. I finally decided to call the police. They were polite but dismissive, chalking it up to a prank or a figment of my imagination. They promised to send a patrol car to drive by my building at night, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. That night, I kept my curtains drawn tightly shut, but I still felt his presence. The air in my apartment felt thick with dread, and every little sound made my heart race. I barely slept, tossing and turning until the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the curtains. It was a week later when things took a terrifying turn. I was home alone, relaxing on the couch after a long day. My roommate was out of town for the weekend. The apartment was eerily quiet, and I found myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see that shadowy figure staring back at me. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen. My heart leapt into my throat as I jumped up, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy book, for protection. I crept towards the kitchen, every step feeling like a lifetime. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see the faint light from the street lamp outside filtering in. I pushed the door open with trembling hands and gasped. The window above the sink was wide open, the cold night air rushing in. I was certain I had locked it earlier. Panic surged through me as I scanned the room, searching for any sign of an intruder. That's when I heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of breathing, coming from the darkness of the hallway behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears. There, standing in the shadows, was the figure. Closer than ever before, just a few feet away, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure took a step closer, and I finally found my voice, screaming at the top of my lungs as I stumbled backwards, tripping over the coffee table and crashing to the floor. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure leaning over me, his face inches from mine, a twisted smile spreading across his lips. Then, there was only darkness. I woke up to the sound of my own ragged breathing and the sensation of cold, hard tiles against my back. My head was throbbing, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back, the figure, the crash, the darkness. I bolted upright, wincing as pain shot through my skull. The apartment was silent. Too silent. The window in the kitchen was still open, the curtains fluttering gently in the night breeze. I forced myself to my feet, clutching the book tightly in my hand. My mind was racing, 100 thoughts and fears colliding all at once. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? Or was the stranger still here, lurking somewhere in the shadows? I checked every room, turning on all the lights and searching every corner. Nothing. The apartment was empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I felt eyes on me from every shadow, every darkened corner. I needed to get out, to get somewhere safe. I grabbed my phone and keys, throwing on a jacket and bolting out the door. Outside, the air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of my apartment. I hurried down the street, not sure where I was going but needing to be anywhere but there. My heart was still pounding, my mind replaying the image of the stranger's twisted smile over and over. I ended up at a 24-hour diner a few blocks away, the fluorescent lights and clinking of dishes a strange comfort. I slid into a booth at the back, my back to the wall so I could see the door. I ordered a coffee, my hands trembling as I took a sip. I needed to calm down, to think clearly. Who was this figure? Why was he tormenting me? And more importantly, how had he gotten inside my apartment? The coffee helped to steady my nerves, and I began to formulate a plan. I couldn't stay in my apartment, at least not alone. I decided to call my roommate, hoping he might come back early or let me crash at his parents' place for a few nights. As I pulled out my phone, it buzzed with a new message. It was from an unknown number. "Did you enjoy our little chat?" My blood ran cold as I read the message. I looked around the diner, half expecting to see the stranger standing outside, watching me through the window. But there was no one. I quickly blocked the number, my fingers shaking as I did so. My roommate's phone went straight to voicemail. I left a hurried message, trying to sound calm but knowing the fear was evident in my voice. With no other options, I decided to head to a nearby motel. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than going back to the apartment alone. The motel was as seedy as they come, but it had a bed and a lock on the door, and that was all I needed. I checked in, paid cash, and headed to my room, locking the door behind me and wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and exhaustion was setting in. I collapsed onto the bed, too tired to even change out of my clothes. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed again. I grabbed it, my heart leaping into my throat. Another message from the same unknown number. "Nice try. See you soon." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The walls of the motel room seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I was trapped, alone, and the stranger knew exactly where I was. The sense of terror was overwhelming, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly helpless. In the oppressive silence of the room, I could swear I heard footsteps outside the door. Slow, deliberate footsteps, getting closer and closer. My breath caught in my throat as the doorknob rattled, the sound echoing through the small room. I pressed myself against the wall, praying the chair would hold, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The footsteps had stopped, and the only sound was the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid to close my eyes, too terrified to move. The stranger was out there, somewhere, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And the worst part was, I had no idea why. Morning light filtered through the dingy curtains of the motel room, but it brought little comfort. I had spent the night in a state of hyper-alertness, every creak and groan of the building sending fresh waves of panic through me. As soon as the first hints of dawn appeared, I hurriedly packed my things and checked out, eager to put as much distance between myself and the nightmarish events as possible. My first stop was the police station. I explained everything to the officer at the desk, the stranger, the messages, the break-in. They listened more attentively this time, perhaps seeing the genuine fear in my eyes, and promised to send someone to investigate my apartment. They also suggested I stay with a friend or family member for a while, which seemed like the best idea. Since my roommate was still out of town and unreachable, I called my sister, Emily. She lived about an hour away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Emily was immediately concerned when I told her what had happened and insisted I come stay with her for a few days. I drove to her place, constantly checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the stranger's face staring back at me. Emily welcomed me with open arms, her house feeling like a safe haven compared to the motel and my apartment. She made me a strong cup of coffee and we sat in her cozy kitchen, sunlight streaming in through the windows. "You look exhausted," she said, concern etched on her face. "What's been going on, exactly?" I recounted everything, from the first sighting of the figure to the terrifying night at the motel. Emily listened in stunned silence, her eyes wide with disbelief. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're safe here," she said firmly. "We'll figure this out." The next few days were a blur. Emily insisted I rest, but sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stranger's twisted smile and heard the slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door. Emily tried to distract me with movies and board games, but my mind was always half listening for any unusual sounds. One evening, as we were watching TV, my phone buzzed again. My heart sank as I saw another message from the unknown number. "Miss me?" I showed Emily, and her face paled. "We need to go to the police again," she said, her voice trembling. "This has to stop." We drove to the nearest police station and showed them the message. They took it more seriously this time, promising to trace the number and look into any recent disturbances in my apartment building. They also suggested I change my phone number, which I did immediately. That night, I felt a little safer, believing the police were finally taking action. Emily and I settled in for another night of trying to distract ourselves with a movie. I was starting to feel a bit more at ease, thinking maybe the worst was over. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the TV cutting off mid-sentence. Emily and I froze, the sudden silence deafening. "What the hell?" Emily whispered, fumbling for her phone. The screen cast a dim light, enough to see her worried expression. "I'll check the breaker," I said, my voice shaking. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed to the basement, Emily following close behind. The stairs creaked under our weight, the beam of the flashlight barely piercing the inky blackness. When we reached the breaker box, I opened it with trembling hands. Everything seemed normal. No trip switches. I was about to close it when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whispering coming from the far corner of the basement. I turned the flashlight in that direction, the beam illuminating a figure standing just a few feet away. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the stranger. He was inside the house. Emily screamed, and the figure moved. I dropped the flashlight in my panic, plunging us back into darkness. I grabbed Emily's hand and we bolted up the stairs, the sound of footsteps close behind us. We ran into the kitchen, slamming the door shut and barricading it with a chair. My mind was racing. How had he found us? What did he want? And more importantly, how were we going to get out of this alive? The whispering continued outside the door, growing louder and more insistent. Emily was crying, clutching her phone with shaking hands. I looked around, desperate for anything we could use to defend ourselves. And then, the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was even more terrifying. We held our breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek through the small window in the door. The basement was empty. The stranger was gone. But the terror remained, and deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The police arrived within minutes after we frantically called them, but the stranger was long gone. They searched the house and surrounding area but found no trace of him. They assured us they would keep a close watch on the neighborhood, but it did little to ease our fear. Emily and I were both on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. The next night, despite the police presence, sleep was impossible. We stayed up, keeping watch, our nerves frayed. I knew we couldn't keep living like this, but I had no idea how to stop it. The stranger seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, a constant, looming threat. It was around 3 a.m. when the power went out again. Emily and I exchanged terrified glances, our hearts pounding in unison. The darkness felt suffocating, every creak of the house magnified. I grabbed the flashlight, the beam shaking as I held it. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. Emily nodded, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. We crept towards the front door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Just as we reached it, the sound of footsteps echoed from the basement. Slow, deliberate footsteps, climbing the stairs. My hand froze on the doorknob, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "He's here," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "We'll make a run for it. On 3. 1. 2. The door burst open, and the stranger stood there, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. Emily screamed, and I swung the flashlight at him with all my strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and the stranger staggered back, but not before grabbing Emily's arm. She was pulled into the darkness, her scream cut off abruptly. "Emily!" I shouted, diving after them, my heart racing with terror. The beam of the flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I reached the basement stairs just in time to see the stranger dragging Emily down, his grip unbreakable. Desperation fueled me as I charged down the stairs, swinging the flashlight wildly. I managed to hit him again, this time in the face. He let go of Emily, snarling in pain. She scrambled away, and I stood between them, the flashlight now a makeshift weapon. "You're not taking her," I said, my voice trembling but determined. The stranger's eyes glowed in the dim light, filled with a malevolent intensity. He lunged at me, and I swung the flashlight again, connecting with his head. He fell to the ground, motionless. Emily and I didn't wait to see if he would get up. We ran up the stairs, out the front door, and into the street, screaming for help. The police, who had been patrolling the neighborhood, arrived within seconds. They found the stranger in the basement, unconscious but alive. Relief washed over us as they took him away in handcuffs. But it wasn't until they removed his mask that the true horror was revealed. The stranger wasn't a stranger at all. He was my roommate. My mind reeled with the implications. The roommate I knew had been out of town. Or so I thought. But the roommate in my apartment had been someone else, a twisted imposter. The real roommate had been taken, his identity stolen by this maniac. As the police pieced together the evidence, it became clear that the imposter had been watching us for months, planning his twisted game. The revelation made my skin crawl. The figure outside the window, the messages, the break-in, it had all been orchestrated by someone I thought I knew, someone I trusted. The betrayal cut deep, a wound that would take a long time to heal. Emily and I moved away, needing a fresh start, far from the nightmares that had haunted us. The police assured us that the imposter was behind bars, but the scars of what we had endured remained. Every now and then, I find myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see a shadowy figure staring back at me. The memory of that twisted smile, the whispered threats, and the terrifying nights linger in my mind, a reminder of how fragile our sense of security truly is. And I'll never forget the chilling realization that sometimes, the real monsters are the ones who wear the faces of friends. The end. Haunted Radio, the terrifying truth unveiled. The attic was a place I rarely ventured. It was a forgotten realm of dust-covered memories and relics that time had cast aside. But today, driven by an unshakable curiosity, I decided to explore the dark corners of my house. I found myself pulling down the creaky ladder and ascending into the musty, dimly lit space. As I rummaged through old boxes, my eyes fell upon something peculiar, a vintage radio, tucked away in the far corner, half covered by a moth-eaten blanket. It was an antique, with polished wooden panels and a large dial in the center. Intrigued, I brushed off the dust and carried it downstairs, setting it on the table in my living room. That night, with nothing but the eerie glow of the moonlight streaming through the windows, I decided to test the old radio. I twisted the dial, and the static-filled airwaves crackled to life. At first, it was just random stations, snippets of music, and garbled voices. But then, something caught my attention. "Welcome to the midnight broadcast," a smooth, sinister voice announced. "Tonight, we take you back to a time of secrets and shadows." I glanced at the clock, 12:01 a.m. The voice continued, weaving tales of events long past, yet somehow they felt disturbingly relevant. My pulse quickened as the stories grew darker, filled with chilling details and ominous predictions. As I listened, a particular broadcast sent a shiver down my spine. It described a gruesome murder that took place in my town 50 years ago. The details were graphic, the descriptions vivid, too vivid. I felt as if I was right there, witnessing the horror unfold. The broadcaster's voice dripped with malevolence, each word a dagger to my senses. And so, the killer left a mark, a blood-stained handprint on the attic wall, a reminder of his twisted work. The voice concluded with a sinister laugh. A sudden noise made me jump. I turned to see my cat, Fluffy, staring intently at the attic door. Her fur stood on end, and a low growl emanated from her throat. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Compelled by a mix of dread and morbid curiosity, I decided to check the attic once more. I climbed the ladder, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder as I neared the top, the wooden boards creaking under my weight. With a flashlight in hand, I scanned the attic walls. And then I saw it, faint but unmistakable, a blood-stained handprint, just as the broadcast had described. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick joke, a coincidence. Suddenly, the radio downstairs crackled to life again, louder this time. The voice, now more menacing, echoed through the house. "Are you enjoying the show? There's so much more to discover. Keep listening, and you might just find the truth." The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. I felt a presence, a whisper of cold air that brushed past me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness of the attic. As I descended the ladder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The radio continued to play, and the voice now spoke directly to me, predicting events that seemed eerily possible, almost as if it knew my future. "Tomorrow night," the voice said, "we'll delve deeper into the mysteries of the past. But be careful, some secrets are best left buried." I turned the radio off, but the words lingered, echoing in my mind. Sleep eluded me that night, as I lay in bed, haunted by the voice and the chilling predictions. What had I stumbled upon? And more importantly, what dark truths were still waiting to be revealed by the old radio? The next day was a blur of anxiety and anticipation. I couldn't focus at work, my mind repeatedly wandering back to the radio and its unsettling broadcast. The handprint in the attic haunted me, and the sinister voice seemed to whisper in the back of my mind, promising more chilling revelations. As night fell, an inexplicable compulsion drew me back to the radio. I tried to resist, but the urge to uncover more of the past was too strong. At precisely midnight, I found myself once again twisting the dial, waiting for the sinister voice to emerge from the static. "Welcome back, dear listener," the voice greeted me, dripping with malevolent glee. Tonight, we revisit the unsolved disappearance of young Emily Harper, who vanished without a trace 20 years ago. A cold chill ran down my spine. I remembered hearing about Emily's disappearance when I was a child. It was a story that had gripped the entire town, but she was never found. The details from the broadcast were eerily precise, recounting her last known whereabouts and the futile search efforts. As the clock struck midnight, Emily was last seen near the old church at the edge of town, the voice continued. But her screams were heard by no one, except perhaps by those who now haunt these very streets. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The voice seemed to taunt me, daring me to investigate further. Suddenly, the radio crackled, and a new sound filled the room, static interspersed with what sounded like faint cries for help. The sound was so realistic that it made my blood run cold. I quickly turned off the radio, but the cries continued to echo in my ears, making it impossible to ignore. With a mixture of fear and determination, I grabbed my coat and decided to visit the old church, hoping to find some answers. The night was eerily quiet as I drove to the edge of town. The full moon cast an unsettling glow on the dilapidated structure. As I stepped out of my car, the air seemed to grow colder, and an oppressive silence settled around me. The church loomed before me, its shadowy interior beckoning me closer. With a flashlight in hand, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The musty smell of decay filled the air, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. As I explored the dark, abandoned space, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered, and I heard a soft whisper behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty pews and the faded remnants of a once vibrant place of worship. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I shone the flashlight towards the altar and gasped. There, in the flickering beam, was a figure, a young girl, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She stood motionless, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak, but no sound emerged. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure took a step towards me, and suddenly, the room was filled with an ear-piercing scream. I stumbled back, tripping over a broken pew and falling hard onto the floor. When I looked up, the girl was gone, and the church was silent once more. Breathing heavily, I scrambled to my feet and hurried out of the church. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced back to my car, the image of Emily's ghostly figure burned into my mind. Back home, I tried to calm my nerves, but the terror of the encounter lingered. I knew I couldn't face the radio again, but the mystery of Emily's disappearance gnawed at me. I had to find out what happened to her, and how it was connected to the radio. The following day, I visited the town's library, searching through old newspapers and archives for any clues. I discovered that Emily's disappearance had been preceded by strange occurrences. Other children had reported seeing a ghostly figure near the church, and some claimed to have heard eerie broadcasts on their radios. I was not the first to be haunted by the old radio. That night, I reluctantly turned the radio back on. The sinister voice greeted me once more, as if expecting my return. "Welcome back, dear listener. Did you enjoy your little excursion to the church?" The voice mocked. But the story is far from over. Tomorrow night, we'll uncover more truths that might just drive you mad. I shivered, knowing that I was in too deep to turn back now. The voice promised revelations, but I feared the cost of uncovering them. The old radio had ensnared me in its dark web, and I was determined to unravel its mysteries, no matter where they led. The following day was a haze of anxiety and dread. Every ticking second brought me closer to midnight, closer to the final broadcast that promised to unveil the truth. I felt like a marionette, controlled by the sinister radio, each broadcast tightening the strings of my fear. As the clock struck midnight, I found myself once again tuning into the old radio. The static hummed and crackled before the familiar, malevolent voice emerged. "Welcome back, dear listener," it intoned, dripping with dark satisfaction. "Tonight, we reveal the final piece of the puzzle. Are you ready to face the truth?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't ready, but I knew there was no turning back. The voice began its tale, each word a nail driving into my sanity. "Years ago, a man named Charles Wexler discovered this very radio," the voice recounted. He, like you, was drawn to its broadcasts, each one more sinister than the last. The radio has the power to connect the living with the restless spirits of the past, feeding on the fear and despair it creates. The voice continued, describing how Charles had become obsessed with the radio, convinced that it was revealing a dark conspiracy against him. His paranoia led him to commit the gruesome murders of his family, driven mad by the malevolent influence of the broadcasts. But Charles was not the first, the voice whispered. And you will not be the last. The radio has a long history, passing from one tormented soul to another, each driven to madness by its dark power. A chill ran down my spine as the voice's tone grew even more sinister. The radio feeds on fear, and it has chosen you as its next victim. Tonight, you will become part of its legacy. I felt a cold dread settle over me. I had to destroy the radio, break its hold over me. But as I reached to turn it off, the voice laughed, a sound so chilling it froze me in place. Do you think it's that simple? The radio is bound to you now, its curse entwined with your fate. There is no escape. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, I saw them, the ghostly figures of Charles Wexler and his family, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Help us, they whispered, their voices a haunting chorus. Free us from the radio's curse. My heart pounded as I realized what I had to do. I grabbed the radio and carried it to the fireplace, throwing it into the flames. The fire roared to life, consuming the old wood and metal, the static-filled cries of the spirits echoing through the room. The ghosts wailed, their forms flickering and fading as the radio burned. The sinister voice screamed in rage, its power waning with each passing second. The room shook, and I felt a sudden, intense pressure in my head. As the radio disintegrated into ash, the room fell silent. The oppressive darkness lifted, and I felt a strange sense of peace. The ghosts of Charles and his family were gone, their souls finally free from the radio's torment. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The nightmare was over. The radio's curse had been broken, its malevolent influence destroyed. In the days that followed, I disposed of the remains of the radio and sealed up the attic, determined to leave the horrors behind. But the experience had changed me, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, as if the radio's curse lingers on the edge of my consciousness. But I remind myself that I survived, that I broke free from its grip. And I pray that no one else ever finds another radio like the one that almost drove me to madness.